Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or good evening, depending on which side of the globe you are watching this event. This is an event organized by the Institute of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Hungary, which seeks to explore the emerging strategic concept of the Indo-Pacific. This is a concept that is gaining more and more currency in global politics, though it is not especially well researched or given due attention to here in Europe, and this we identified as a gap, and IFAT is now trying to fill this gap. So right now we are planning to have a series of conversation about this issue to get a little more acquainted with it. So maybe later on we will have further outlooks and further topics about the Indo-Pacific concept as well. At this present one, we have three different regional angles about what Indo-Pacific actually means. One from Korea, one from Japan, and one from Australia. So I would like to present our three speakers today. So let me begin. Let me have an alphabetical order here. So Mr. Wondeuk, who is a senior researcher from the Institute for Foreign Affairs and National Security from the Republic of Korea. Then we have Ms. Kyoko Hatakeyama, who's a professor at Kansai Gaidai University.
Actually, I'm working for Niigata, University of Niigata Prefecture now.
Okay, so maybe I'm lagging behind with your title. Sorry, but the whole event was broadcast with this title again. So sorry for that. But you used to work.
Yes,
okay,
I was working there.
Okay, thank you. But again, from Japan, from distinguished higher education career. And last but not least, we have Ms. Huong, who is a senior analyst from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute from Canberra. Thank you very much for joining us. This is Tamás, Baranyi, Deputy Director at the Institute of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Before we set out to the conversation, I would speak a few words about the format today. So I will ask our presenters to give an overview of their vision of the Indo-Pacific in like 8 to 10 minutes. Then I ask them a few questions and move on to the Q&A session as well. As is usual with IFAT events, I would ask our audience to submit their questions, not directly, but through chat and to me or maybe to all panelists, and they will be read aloud and answered at the latter part of the event. I'm very happy that we have such a wide audience. Not only from Hungary, from Poland and the region, but also from the Indo-Pacific actually. So we're very happy about that, especially, our very numerous, audience from Japan. Okay, so without further ado, I would go on to the very first part of this conversation. So I would ask the presenters to have their introductory talks. Again, we will use an alphabetical order. So please, Mr. Chiu, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for so much for having me in this terrific seminar regarding regional outlooks. In fact, actually, I'm a research professor at the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security of Korea National Diplomat Academy. And before getting started, I would like to note that my opinions and discussions do not represent the institution that I belong to. Yeah. And regarding the regional outlooks, I was asked to talk about Korea's new Southern policy. And so I'm going to briefly explain the concept of a new Southern policy of Korea as a regional policy initiative. And then I will talk about some contents of newly reorganized and New Southern Policy Plus, published in 2020 amid the COVID-19 pandemics. So regarding the new Southern policy in general, current Moon Jae-in government, having taken office in May 2017, has been pursuing a key foreign policy initiative for the strengthening of Korea's international role and status, and the diversification of diplomacy for continuous economic prosperity and the expansion of a diplomatic space. Diplomatic diversification actually includes diplomatic cooperation and geographical scope and agenda of the cooperation and diversification of cooperative partners. So at the center of its Korea's diversification of diplomacy is the new Southern policy. So President Moon Jae-in announced the new Southern policy during his visit to Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines for the 2017 APEC summit and the ASEAN Plus 3 and East Asia Summit meetings. Focusing on actually three visions of New Southern policy: people, prosperity, and peace. So the New Southern policy aims to build a people-to-people and heart-to-heart community and prosperity community that lives well together through the economic cooperation. And lastly, a peace community that contributes to peace and stability in Asia through security cooperations. The goal of the South Korea's new Southern policy, which puts ASEAN and India as key partners, can be summarized into three aspects. The first, it is to build a new space of prosperity by strengthening economic cooperation with ASEAN and India. Second, beyond the diplomacy centered on North Korea's nuclear weapons program and Korean Peninsula, it is to further expand the agenda for diplomatic space and diplomatic cooperation between ASEAN and India and South Korea. Third, it is to strengthen community building efforts by strengthening economic, diplomatic, and social cooperation with ASEAN and India beyond Northeast Asia centered on the Korean Peninsula. In this regard, South Korea's new Southern policy has three policy elements. The first is the new Southern policy has the nature of the new foreign policy, economic policy, pursuing diversification of Korea's external economic relations. The Korea's foreign trade structure is actually tilted to major economies such as China, the United States, Japan, and EU, and making it vulnerable to external pressure or shock. In order to overcome these kind of external economic vulnerabilities, it is necessary to diversify Korea's external economic portfolio, which is focused on specific countries, and expand participation in a more dynamic global production network. Secondly, the new Southern policy goes beyond the existing diplomacy around the Korean Peninsula to serve as a diplomatic rebalancing policy toward the partners in the region, such as ASEAN and India. It is true that ASEAN has previously remained as a secondary partner in Korean diplomacy in the past. But actually, the South Korea would like to reserve the North Korean issues and Korean Peninsula issues. But the previous government, which it actually the tabled overcoming inter-Korean divisions and its accompanying policy challenges as the biggest diplomatic task, had no choice but to focus on diplomacy in the regions surrounding the peninsula. However, actually the reality is that countries like ASEAN and India are now establishing themselves as a cooperative partner. That those countries are essential to promoting Korea's national interest diplomatically and economically. So Korea has a very motivation and incentive to upgrade bilateral diplomatic relations with ASEAN and India to the level of the Korea's relations with the four major powers surrounding Korean Peninsula, such as United States, Japan, Russia, and China. So in this regard, South Korea aims to ease competitions which resulted in mature exclusion and mutually exclusive regional order, and to form institutional devices and norms to establish an inclusive regional structure in Asia-Pacific region. So in particular, Korea pursued regional cooperation based on the principles of openness, transparency, and inclusiveness through the New Southern policies. So the government of Korea set up the Special Presence Committee to implement this New Southern policy and to coordinate various initiatives by ministries, agencies, and local governments under the umbrella of the New Southern policy. So since its announcement in 2017, New Southern policy has produced several intermediate outcomes, largely in the form of expanded diplomatic engagement. But recently, we have been suffering from the impact of a COVID-19 pandemic. So last year, President Moon Jae-in attended Korea ASEAN Summit, and he announced their newly organized New Policy Plus. It's a kind of upgraded version of the New Southern policy, and to reflect the changing international environment and the needs and demands of Southeast Asian countries, in particular in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, and this New Southern Policy Plus has a significance as a New Southern policy implementation strategy over the next 5 years, reflecting the changed international environment and the demand for cooperation due to COVID-19. So the New Southern Policy Plus has a new and actionable measures to focus on 7 key cooperation areas based on the achievements of the New Southern policy over the past 3 years. In particular, the New Southern Policy Plus aims to set a top priority for health and medical cooperation with the Southeast Asian countries to overcome COVID-19 and its consequence effect on economy, and to promote comprehensive and long-term health cooperation by fully expanding and reorganize the contents and scale of the healthcare cooperation project. Actually, in the original New Southern policy, most of the projects are based on the usual cooperation, but relatively has a low importance in the COVID-19 effect. So the New Southern Policy Plus changed the content of the New Southern policy by focusing on using of the existing official development agents assistance program to promote the relations with the Southeast Asian countries to solve and resolve the COVID-19 pandemic. So in another feature of New Southern Policy Plus is the decision to promote South Korea and maritime Southeast Asian corporations to cooperate with the maritime Southeast Asian countries, such as the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, and Singapore. So the South Korea and maritime Southeast Asia cooperation will be carried out through the creation of cooperation fund, which will push for cooperative projects, mainly in the maritime sector, including the developing island villages, coastal cities, and strengthening its ability to cover the marine waste. So previously, Korea is already successfully promoting the Korea Mekong Cooperation and Korea Mekong Cooperation Fund with mainly in the Southeast Asian countries. And while this kind of the cooperation between Korea and maritime Southeast Asia has a significance as a kind of the newly established Korea and ASEAN cooperation mechanisms that balances in line with the Korea Mekong corporations. So as I previously mentioned, that the new Southern Policy Plus has 7 key cooperation areas through selection and concentrations on areas with high demand from Southeast Asian countries in the changed environment after COVID-19. So, for example, 7 areas include public health cooperation and sharing Korea's education model, providing aid in human resources development, encouraging cultural exchange, establishing a reciprocal and sustainable basis for trade and investment, and cooperation in developing urban and rural infrastructure, and cooperation in future industries, and cooperation on non-traditional security issues. Those are the feature of the new Southern Policy Plus as a regional policy initiative of South Korea. So I will stop here and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cho. Just one remark on my side. This is part of the aim of this event and this series to get a little closer to what's happening in this region, and it's just fantastic how little one who pays a lot of attention to global political processes can be lost in all those policy initiatives and their actual direction. So thank you very much for giving an introduction to this, and I would just give the floor to Mr. Hatakeyama.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me to such a great conference. I'm Kyoko Hatakeyama, Professor of Graduate School of International Studies and Regional Development, University of Niigata Prefecture. So before I talk about Indo-Pacific Concept, let me say that I'm very happy to announce that I published a new book about Japan's security policy. The title is Japan's Evolving Security Policy, Militarization within a Pacifist Tradition. So as you notice, Japan has been expanding its military role in the post-Cold War period. This book explains why Japan shifted its security policy by examining the collective ideas of political parties and the effect of an international norm. So when explaining the factors for Japan's shift, existing literature emphasizes the external factors such as North Korea's nuclear weapons and China's military rise. However, I argue that the international factor is not the sole reason. Rather, the change of collective ideas held by the political parties and Japan's socialization of the international norm pushed the shift. However, I argue that shift have occurred in ways that do not violate the pacifist domestic norm. So if you are interested in that, I hope you read it. Thank you very much. So today I will talk about the Indo-Pacific concept. I talk where the concept comes from and also how the regional states perceive the concept. So first of all, I talk about Japan's case. Japan became concerned about increasing China's gray zone activities in the 2000s. As a result, Japan started to emphasize India as a strategic partner. Japan's emphasis on India was accentuated by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's speech in 2007 at the Indian Parliament titled Confluence of the Two Seas. The speech coupled the Indian and Pacific Oceans by identifying them as seas of freedom and of prosperity. Although Abe did not use the Indo-Pacific in a speech, he expanded the scope of Asia by including India as in broader Asia. The Indo-Pacific concept suddenly attracted attention when Japanese Abe announced the FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy, at the 6th Tokyo International Conference on African Development in Nairobi in 2016. The announcement was remarkable because the concept was considered as a counterbalance to China's Belt and Road initiatives. The concept is notable in 3 points. First, unlike Arc of Freedom and Prosperity thesis, which was announced by the first Abe government in 2006, this Indo-Pacific strategy excluded the emphasis on liberal values, such as human rights and democracy. It instead emphasized the values such as economic prosperity, rule of law, and capacity building support on maritime law enforcement. These principles were not controversial and rather welcome by all states. Second, it emphasized capacity building support to the state in the region. The reason why the Japanese government has emphasized this approach is such support involves communication and interaction between Japan and the recipient states. That means the capacity building support enables Japan to convey its idea on the preferable regional order and the importance of compliance to international law. Third, it highlighted the importance of economic prosperity and Japan's willingness to promote economic growth of the region, which extends to Africa. By proposing such a comprehensive concept that highlighted Japan's readiness for leading economic growth and the importance of rule of law, Japan repackaged the current regional framework to a more attractive one than China's Belt and Road initiatives. Japan's proposal of the Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy attracted worldwide attention from academics as well as officials, and it stimulated debates on the blueprint of the region's future among the regional states. In response, the United States adopted the Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy as its strategy, although US stance is more confrontational. It is also more exclusive than Japan's FOIP. Japan's Indo-Pacific concept welcomes China as long as China respects rules and norms. The United States also introduced Blue Dot Network concept, which is like a Michelin star guide for restaurants. Likewise, Australia has emphasized the importance of rules-based order over the past decade. Australia's emphasis on the rules-based order was accentuated in the 2016 Defense White Paper, in which rules-based order was mentioned no less than 48 times. China's assertive behavior in the maritime domain made Australia increasingly concerned if it might lead to the emergence of a power-based order. Australia also announced Pacific Step Up in 2016. The Pacific Step Up aims to deepen Australia's engagement with the Pacific nations by providing financial support to deal with climate change, poverty, economic growth, and so on. The background of the initiative is that China has increased its engagement with these nations by providing financial support. To prevent these states from falling into the so-called debt diplomacy, Australia renewed its determination. ASEAN was also concerned with China's assertiveness in the maritime domain. In 2013, Indonesia unveiled the Indo-Pacific concept and attempted to develop the concept in cooperation with other ASEAN states. However, other ASEAN states were not willing to develop the concept at this stage because ASEAN was not ready to clarify the picture of the future regional order. Also, they were not ready to decide how to relate themselves to the growing China's influence. But again, in 2018, Indonesia announced its Indo-Pacific Concept, which centered on ASEAN centrality, transparency, and inclusiveness of the region. This is followed by the announcement of the Asean Outlook on the Indo-Pacific at the ASEAN Summit meeting in 2019. The concept emphasized a rule-based framework, inclusivity of the region, respect for international law such as UNCLOS, and ASEAN-led framework including East Asian Summit. While ASEAN supported rule-based rules and laws as principles, it also underlined ASEAN's centrality in rule-making process in the region. It also tries to include China in the concept. India's concept also emphasized the rules and norm-based order in principle. India, which increasingly attracted attention due to its rapid economic growth, also presented its view on the maritime order. So India expressed the idea of free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific region at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2018. India then announced the Indo-Pacific Ocean Initiative at the 2019 East Asian Summit, emphasizing the inclusiveness of the concept and its strategic autonomy. This India's vision implied its desire to maintain autonomy without deeply involved in a power competition between the United States and China. India's approach to the region that underlined rules and norms has a lot in common with those of Japan, Australia, and ASEAN. However, like ASEAN's vision, India emphasized the inclusiveness of the region, meaning the inclusion of China in the framework. Thus, responding to China's challenge to the existing regional order, the regional actors expressed their views on the preferable regional order. These announcements demonstrated the regional states' rising interest and concern for the future regional order. The primary factor driving the move lay in their growing apprehensions about China's attempts to change the status quo by force. All concepts underline the importance of rules and international laws in principle, while opposing the exclusivity of the region. These states share the principles, but have a different view in detail as to what degree and how they pursue this principle. In particular, they have different attitudes toward China. The most important actor, the United States, continues to show its interest in engaging in the region. Japan, Australia, India, and ASEAN welcome US involvement in the region very much because it is not possible for them to counterbalance China, which is economically and militarily rising. Japan had been the second largest economy, but its GDP accounts for only 1/3 of China's GDP now. Moreover, Japan does not have military power. Although these states do not want to be drawn into a competition between the United States and China, they are concerned with Chinese assertive behavior and the possibility of the emergence of a power-based order. Unless somebody stops China's attempts to change the status quo by force, Chinese-centered regional order likely emerges. Therefore, generally speaking, they welcome US engagement. If not, they are completely in line with the US policy. On one hand, these states are apprehensive of Chinese dominance. On the other hand, they need Chinese money to boost their economy. In particular, ASEAN badly needs Chinese money to develop infrastructure or to boost economic growth. Even Japan hopes to maintain good relationship with China because China is the largest trading partner for Japan. China also occupies an important place in the supply chain. In particular, Japan depends on Chinese rare earths. Therefore, although they are not able to accept Chinese unilateral claims in the security area, they still hope to maintain good relationships with China, especially in an economic area, and hope that China will change its behavior in due course if they strengthen the multinational frameworks or multilateral cooperation. So during the Cold War period, there was no close interdependence between the West and the East Bloc. However, economics is increasing its political importance in a globalized world, which making it difficult for states to take action without thinking about economic consequences. Unless states reduce their dependence on China by building a supply chain that does not overly depend on China, it is not easy for us to take a firm attitude toward China. China uses its economic strength as a stick. The states do not want to give up benefits from China. Under these circumstances, the regional states unfortunately have to take a balancing behavior. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. I was very happy to have heard something about the seeming contradiction here that on the one hand, Indo-Pacific is often described as something invented to counter the Belt and Road Initiative on the one hand, and on the other hand, there are often talks, especially in the region, that China on different conditions is also part of this concept, and this is something that is very interesting, I think, for the European audience as well, because in some ways, but maybe not to this extent, we have similar problems.
Yeah,
as well here.
exactly.
Yeah. So even though we are at the two poles of the world, we share many things about this outlook. So thank you again, and Mr. Thu, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion. I'm delighted to share some of my thoughts. So my name is Dr. Huong I'm a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, where I work, among other things, on also comparative concepts of the Indo-Pacific and regional Southeast Asian responses. But in this short presentation, I'll focus mainly on the recent development of Australia's attitude and Australia's policies towards the Indo-Pacific. Now, if you look at the map where you see Australia is actually a very maritime country. It's surrounded by two oceans. So by this nature of geographical position, Australia claims that the Indo-Pacific is the most natural way of describing its position, its interests, and therefore also informs its strategy and policy. And like my co-presenter said, that Indo-Pacific, or even Peter said that Indo-Pacific is relatively new. There are studies that would show that actually Australia has started using the term Indo-Pacific quite early on. And there are historical maps that shows that, the term of Indo-Pacific has been actively used as well. So it's not entirely new term. It is now renewed in a way that it is used. And of course, it entitles much more than just geography, just the two oceans, the concept of Indian Ocean and then the Pacific Ocean. Now, if you look at the policy side, we mainly look at the foreign policy white paper that Australia issued in 2017, when it started to actively use the term Indo-Pacific, and since then really rebranding the foreign policy, and even the departments within the foreign policy Department of Foreign Policy and Trade, which is ministry, equivalent to ministry, also has started to have internal units that are called Indo-Pacific. So the Indo-Pacific term is actively used, not only in terms of describing a big region, but also really actively in their everyday policy. So what is Indo-Pacific, right? We couldn't agree on what exactly entails Indo-Pacific. Like my co-presenter said that Japan has different geographical limits in terms of how it looks at Indo-Pacific. US has different. India has different, Australia has different, and also my co-presenter from South Korea said mainly it focused on Southeast Asia. Now, Australia doesn't also go too much details on really hard defining geographically, but what it sees is broadly the two oceans, but more relevant to its strategy is that Indo-Pacific is based on rules-based order, so reaffirming the rules-based order, democratic values, freedom of navigation and overflight, multilateralism, free trade, and of course, in terms of diplomacy, putting ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, at the center of its policy, because ASEAN or Southeast Asian region is basically Australia's next door neighbors. Now, the biggest benefactors of Australia Indo-Pacific strategy so far has actually been not ASEAN, but the Pacific. But I'll get to ASEAN in a minute too, because it's really very important region as well. The document that I mentioned, the foreign policy white paper, has been later on developed by foreign ministers and defense ministers at their Shangri-La dialogue speeches, and many other and prime ministers that go to the region, and a lot of that has been happening actually in Southeast Asia. So there is a recognition that the region is very important. It's basically 2/3 of global growth. It's nearly, it's over 40%, nearly 50% of global GDP. And the population concentration, the economic power, and of course the diplomatic and geostrategic center. And I think what Australia wants to do with its strategies and policies is actually to actively contribute to the building of the order, or of the shaping of the order. So it wants an Indo-Pacific that it's open, inclusive, respectful of sovereignty, as it described it, where conflict can be and disputes can be resolved peacefully without force of coercion. So that doesn't never explicitly mention China, but it does a lot of mention is really referring to Chinese activities, and particularly military activities in the region and the maritime domain. Australia wants an Indo-Pacific that has open market, free flow of trade, capital and ideas, and have underpinned by rule of law and the right of the states to protect each other. One of the recent speech that the Prime Minister Scott Morrison gave just before the pandemic outbreak, he said that we are now at the most significant change. We are now witnessing the most significant change in the relationship between US and China, and this particular set of relationship exert great influence on our region, right? So we are in a very testing time, and I think since then that notion only deteriorated in strategic environment and strategic circles in Australia. There are more talks about how insecure the region is, how we are close to any war than we've been in decades, and it's a lot of tension happening, including not only South China Sea and Southeast Asia, but more so with concerns on the Taiwan Straits. So the concern had been rising, and the Indo-Pacific is the primary theater of those forces happening. And you can see that in the most recent paper called the Defense Strategic Update that was released in July 2020. So in the midst of the global pandemic, Australia's Defense Departments issued a new document that talks about how tense and actually dangerous our region is. And that the possibility of conflict is much higher than it was ever before. And the document also outlines what is Australia's role in the Indo-Pacific, but its summary can be put in three phrases, to shape Australian strategic environment, to deter actions against Australian interest, and to respond with credible military force when required. So in short, I think the strategy is about, first of all, it described the rapidly changing environment that the global rules-based order and multilateralism can no more be taken for granted. But Australia's interest is to uphold and sustain those norms and rules that it holds dearly, and therefore it outlines Australia's active role as one of the active Indo-Pacific powers to be able to take up on the responsibility of upholding the rules-based order. I would stress also the China factor. Obviously, it's not really explicitly mentioned in those documents, although it has been mentioned several times. But I do want to underline the issue of China and just to what extent it worries Australia. As you know, probably in the recent years, the relationship between Australia and China has deteriorated quite significantly, even though, unlike Southeast Asian neighbors, Australia doesn't have any territorial disputes with China. It now has trade issues with China. Obviously, it is deteriorated on the diplomatic ground, but also more and so on the economic and trade issues. Australia is trust towards China has really plummeted, and it's really concerned about the future, where China would have a shaping role in the region. Australia is uneasy of a thought that the region could be ruled by undemocratic forces that would challenge the democracies in the region, that would interfere with domestic issues. And the issue of domestic interference is very high on the priority list. You would probably hear about Australia's recent development in domestic laws that would also country agnostic and often not mention China by explicitly by name, but often it was triggered by Chinese action. For example, the law on the decision on 5G in Huawei. Australia was actually first country to do that. Another thing was about foreign interference or foreign donation to the parties that was also triggered by the Chinese, who had influence on an Australian parliamentarian who changed his view and his party view on South China Sea. So there are many triggers that in recent years have emerged that have shaped Australia's views on China, but also its views of what a region dominated by China could look like. And it's certainly undesirable for Australia and undesirable for the Indo-Pacific. And it's considered unfavorable for the democracies in the Indo-Pacific. And that's why Australia is stepping up that much, whether it's in the Pacific or increasingly it's expanding its influence and trying at least to expand its input in Southeast Asia to actually counter those scenarios, to provide options. So countries, as the government often says, it wants countries in the region, whether they are Pacific Islanders or Southeast Asian, to have options other than, for example, Chinese lending, which triggered the debt trap diplomacy, as it is considered with many of the Belt and Road initiatives. So that's in short what Australia is doing. Currently, I think Australia is one of the more active members of the Indo-Pacific and active promoters of the Indo-Pacific concept. It is one of the key, very eager participants of the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which recently has elevated to leaders level, and it is now contributing actively to a number of other initiatives, not only in security realm, but also in quality infrastructure, in COVID responses, vaccines, and so on and so forth. So Australia is thinking very actively about how it can contribute and leverage its middle power status and also active power status in the Indo-Pacific to uphold the rules-based order and counter the forces that it considers unfavorable for itself, but also to the region. I think I will stop here to allow a sufficient time for Q&A, because I think we only have 15 minutes or so left. So I'll stop here, but I'm happy to take any questions related to Australia or Southeast Asians' view on the Indo-Pacific too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, my voice is a little echoing, but I think it stopped now. Okay, so thank you very much. It was all three wonderful presentation, and I'm a little in pain of what to ask of the many emerging questions, but maybe let's start out with infrastructure investments, because I thought it was or this is the impression here, that infrastructure investments are core to, let's say, this alliance building or alignment building in the Indo-Pacific region. And just to have an example or have a parallel again from Europe, this reminds us to a certain extent to the Free Seas Initiative. This is something again that is supported by the United States, also not to counter Chinese influence, but maybe to counter Russian influence in this region, and it also puts heavy emphasis on infrastructure projects. Obviously, it also has a dimension to counter, let's say, BRI project, and I think this countering BRI project is something very important in the Indo-Pacific as well. But again, Europeans tend to look this as more of something not mutually exclusive. So in a European outlook, Belt and Road Initiative and Free Seas Initiative can be complementary, and European countries basically gain because they have they are diversifying their sources and their projects. And I am wondering whether this Indo-Pacific alignment and the Belt and Road Initiative, so how the regional countries basically view those two or maybe other ones. So is this something very antagonistic or something that the regional countries can make the best out of? So how much it is antagonistic and how much can be complementary? So who would wish to answer me first?
I'm happy to start. I think it really depends on which countries you are asking, but in general, if there is any generalization, I would say most countries, and I speak mostly about Southeast Asian, but I think to that degree it also applies to the Pacific ones. The need is so huge that no one single country can provide. Let's start with that. Not even China, not Belt and Road Initiative. No one can fulfill all the needs there are for the infrastructure. That's number one. Number two, I think countries in the region would welcome. I don't think they see it as either or. In fact, Japan has been very active and for much longer than the Belt and Road Initiative. In Southeast Asia, Japan is really the leader rather than China. Of course, the Belt and Road looks good, looks big in the newspapers, but in fact, Japan has been actually, and my colleague can speak more details to that. So I don't think the countries in Southeast Asia see it as either or. They happily would accept investment from China, from US, from Australia, from anyone who is able to provide those infrastructure, and South Korea. But with caveat to the third point that I would make is that Belt and Road Initiative has been labeled as debt trap diplomacy. There are many unviable actually investments. There are often prolonged and often it comes in reality much at higher cost than at the tendered, and the safety and standards are quite lower. So they are quite problematic, often causing some tensions on the ground. But at the same time, the quality infrastructure partnership that I mentioned, the US, Australia, and Japan, are relatively small at this point and not yet as developed. I mean, Japan on its own is a very significant infrastructure investor, but as branded at this under that trilateral cooperation and US Build Act and all kind of other initiatives, it's relatively new and relatively little, small. I think there are only few viable projects going on at the moment. So, it's one thing to promise and another thing to materialize. And I believe that COVID also complicates a lot of plans and projects as we're going on now. So these also have to be taken into considerations. I think for countries in the region, as long as it's meets the needs, it's real, then they would welcome any investor. Doesn't matter, it doesn't have to exclude one on another.
So can I say something? Actually, Japan supports China's BRI, and it's clearly said Japan supports China's BRI as long as China's plan is viable and transparent. So what Japan is worried is China's development plan is not sometimes viable and lacks transparency. And Japan also opposed China's use of economic strength as a coercion, and also opposed the so-called debt diplomacy. So what Japan wants to emphasize is or promote is transparency of the project, and also sustainability, and also the quality of the infrastructure. And so that is the point which actually make a clear contrast to China's BRI. So, for example, and also Japan is ready to support AIIB because Japan has been held a presidential position of the ADB, Asian Development Bank, and Japan has lots of know-how in providing financial assistance for infrastructure development. So Japan is very happy to support China's AIIB as well, although Japan did not join the AIIB. So what I want to say is Japan has no intention to confront China. However, it's worried, and it's worried about China's use of economic strength, and also China's way of implementing infrastructure project. Thank you.
Okay. The center of the reason which is strongly affected by the Chinese BRI is Mekong region, Mekong Basin regions. And so, as you might know, according to statistics, there are approximately more than 15 international Mekong development corporations right now working. And Korea also the part of the Mekong regional cooperation mechanisms. We have the Mekong Korea corporations. Basically, our cooperation mechanism is very inclusive. We can coordinate, we can cooperate with any kind of the regional cooperation mechanism, such as the United States LMI and Lantang Mekong corporations. We are very inclusive. If there is some convergence regarding the cooperative areas. So, and also the Mekong region is the #1 destination of Korea's official development program. So in that regard, we are ready to cooperate with other countries' regional corporations, as I said before, even the Mekong Ganga corporations. So, but as far as I know, even the Mekong countries like Cambodia and Laos and Myanmar, in particular, the Western countries sometimes, to some extent, criticize that debt treatment, especially their high rate of debt in Laos and other countries. But whenever before the COVID-19, whenever I talk with the expert in Myanmar and Cambodia and Laos, they had no choice but to accommodate any kind of support from even in China and the United States and Japan, and they are trying to make their in a balanced way. In that regard, and I think the countries outside of the Southeast Asian countries, especially the countries which embark and engage in Mekong region countries, can cooperate. At this time, most of the regional cooperation mechanisms work in a separate way, not collaborative way. So in that regard, Korea and personally speaking, we are ready to cooperate with other countries in Mekong region, even with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and Mekong Cooperation, and in Australia and the United States.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cho. I don't know what was the experience of the others, but in my computer, I think your most exciting parts were just lagging behind, and I think your most important sentence I just couldn't follow, but I have the impression of what you've been saying. I think, judged from your presentation as well, that core of Korean foreign policy in this regard is largely inclusiveness, and I also have this impression that regional countries are more taking this very concept as an inclusive concept, even though, or at least for me, there is a sensible pressure from U.S. side to make it a little more exclusive, like something to strengthen, let's say, classical democracies against Chinese influence. Like regional countries are more like inclusive and say, yes, on different conditions, we are actually very happy to engage China, and also we are pretty much dependent on trade with China. For instance, Australia is a very good example when there is a very strong political stance, but also trade interconnectedness that actually limits this algorithm. Okay, so this was my impression, at least. But thank you very much for yours. And so if you would like to respond my impressions, you are welcome. But if not, then I go check some of the questions that we received. One question is, how do you view China's activities in international organizations, mostly in the WTO? And there is another question that is specifically Ms. Lethu. Do you think that Chinese trade sanctions will continue to fail to change Australia's attitude towards China? Or could the economic pain caused to certain sectors eventually lead to Australia giving in to Chinese pressure, at least to a certain extent? Okay, so I think maybe I ask this second question to you, Ms. Lethu, and then we have this round with those with the VTO.
Thank you. In terms of sanctions, I think it's very tense at the moment, and diplomatically it sounds really serious. I'm not an economist, but there have been some preliminary economic analysis about that, and they suggested that actually the loss that Australia has suffered is not as big yet. And it really depends on which sector. For example, barley, beef, wine, and other exports products really dropped quite significantly. But iron ore, for example, it's barely, it's barely visible in terms of if China continues to buy iron ore from Australia, and then there's not really. I don't think China needs iron ore, so probably that would be one of the last things that would go off the list. There is also a higher education sector, which Australia's universities heavily depend on Chinese students, and this has been paired with COVID. Actually, it's both. There will be responses from China, which means that the Chinese will be probably in some way calling for boycotting Australians' universities. But at the same time, because of COVID, a lot of international students couldn't come anyway. So it's hard to really count whether it was direct political effect or, it's paired with the COVID restrictions. At the same time, that some products that I mentioned, like barley, beef, and wine, and others that have gone down to export to Australia, to China, they have gone up to other markets. So it's actually helping Australia to diversify a little bit. Now, I think it's still too early to have real grasp on the size of loss. Because it's more engaging in diplomatic warfare and war of words, and the numbers will show with a little bit of delay. But at the moment, the attitudes are really bad, and I think Australia is really reacting very strongly. There are some in business community and that are calling for a more measured approach and a better handling of the China crisis. But by and large, in general, I think this government is very strong on responding to the bully in a bully way as well, and that has been really the practice. There are some aspect that you might point to that actually it's not. Australia is not entirely playing the tough game, and has, for example, hasn't called the Uyghur as genocide as, for example, Canada has, but in many ways it is playing a tough game. And the population's opinion, public opinion about China has really deteriorated in many ways. So I think for a while it's going to continue to be rough, and it would be probably with this government, it's probably not really willing to concede to China's pressure. So it will be a little bit, the diplomatic war of words will continue for some time.
See, thank you. And what about multilateralism, China's role in multilateral institutions, especially the WTO? What impact do you expect in the near future? So that was the other question. So whoever wishes to answer.
Okay. Actually, I'm not an expert on WTO or like that, but I would like to express my own opinion regarding just the Chinese activity in international organization, institutions in general. But I'd like to see and regard China as the international players is the general players like the nation state. Unlike the previous time, China it is rise economically and diplomatically. At the same time, China has a variety of the leverage to expanding its sphere of influence in the world. So the China can use and utilize its rising economic power. At the same time, China can raise its voice in international institutions and organizations. I think that theoretically in international relations, it's a natural phenomenon because once a countries rise and they need to they want to raise their voice and intention to influence international relations. But the problem is that the ways to express their opinion and their intention in international institutions. So, but I think that in the positive side, the Chinese activities in international organization is natural in a theoretical of international relations. But on the other side, it's a way to express their opinion and intention in international organizations is a little bit blunt, and it's to some extent problematic. So that's my the personal personal views.
I see. Thank you very much. For your personal views, but they were actually very insightful. So thank you. Before we close, I received just one more question. Whether do you see the present U.S.-China conflict in the region as something of a new Cold War? Can it be termed as a new Cold War in this framework? I will also add, I mean, this is just a short, circular question, because I was very happy that Ms. Hatakeyama actually already touched on this issue, whether it can be called or termed the new Cold War. I think I have to add also that in Europe, we see with a certain degree of concern that tensions are rising in this region, or at least this is the impression. I mean, in the Korean Peninsula, there have always been high because of nuclear weapons, but also in Japan there was this, leaving Pacific traditions to a certain extent. It was also something that reached Europe as a news, and it was a little concernful that it actually signified the rise of tensions. And also in Australia there was this defense debate with Mr. Hugh White's book and all those things that Australia has to rely more on their own military power and such. So what we see is a rising US-Chinese rivalry, and also sort of a militarization of the ever-growing military expenditures in the region. So this is why I think it's very interesting for Europeans. So the question is, again, would you term this situation as a new Cold War?
Okay. Yes, the tensions between the United States and China is rising, as you can see. However, so maybe we can call it a new Cold War. However, I don't think the competition would occur in the military area. Of course, they are going to compete each other in the military area, but the main focal point is economic area. So that's why the United States tried to establish a global supply chain that excludes China. And also the United States is very keen to develop advanced technology, 5G or AI and that sort of things with Japan, Australia and other like-minded states by excluding China. So the real competition would occur in the economic area. But at the same time, of course, they try to maintain the balance in the military area. And then, as you said, militarization in the region is maybe happening, I think. And Japan actually, as I talked about in my book, Japan shifted its security strategy. And also some of you may say, okay, Japan militarized so much. However, Japan's militarization would happen in a pacifist tradition, as I argue. And so that's why Japan may take action to support US military action when something happens, like, a limited war over the Taiwan Strait or a limited war on the Korean Peninsula. However, unless these things without such a conflict, I don't think Japan would militarize a lot. So the real competition would occur in the economic area. That is my view.
Thank you. So, do you have anything to add at this point? Or we can move on to close the session. Okay. In this case, I think that was an excellent conversation, and me personally, I got much closer to the regional outlooks on the Indo-Pacific, and also how intricate is the web of different outlooks and different policy designs in the region. So I think it was very enriching. Let me thank you for our audience as well, especially those who posed questions: Adam Chenger, Anna Kelle, Alina Martinez. Thank you for joining us and listening to us. Again, thank you very much for coming. Those who with whom we have this conversation. I think IFAT will continue to have this item on the agenda, Indo-Pacific, and what it actually means and how it is being developed, because it's pretty much in developing still. Maybe we'll get back to this topic later on to our audience. At this point, thank you very much again for joining us, Mr. Wondeuk, Ms. Kyoko Hatakeyama, and Ms. Huong. Thank you very much, and have a nice evening on the other side of the globe, and have a nice day for our audience in Europe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.